Welcome back. This is the third part of my advocacy training for Nevada kinship caregivers. Again, this is Dr. Ali Caliendo. I'm the Executive Director of Foster Kinship, and I am here now to talk to you about how I have solved one specific problem. I'm going to use the example of how we went after legislative change for the problem of financial support for caregivers caring for children in foster care. So hopefully you've already watched me sort of ramble for the first two videos. You have the context for what we're about to talk about. And really, again, this is just to give you an example of how to pursue change and also to hopefully encourage you to do it and to set your expectations that it is a hard, long process. I have a very good friend in policy advocacy in another state who says if you can get it done in 7 years, it's a huge win, right? So it is a slow process for change, but let your fire that you're feeling now and your anger and the outrage and the fact that this shouldn't be happening, let that continue to fuel you over the long run so that you can keep doing the difficult work of change. It is long and hard, but please let me encourage you to do it. So I'm once again going to share my screen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's next in terms of how to solve a specific problem. So you guys have already seen this in part 2 about defining the problem. I'm going to talk to you now about how I defined a specific problem that I identified really early on, about 7-8 years ago, and the steps that I took to resolve it. So first thing is, in defining the problem, I needed to understand the landscape. So I talked in part 2 about really understanding all the sources and what the data tells us. So my issue was that I was noticing that families weren't getting equitable financial support. When I first started learning about kinship care, I kind of equated kinship care and foster care in my head as the same thing. Silly me, because once I started doing the research on children who can't live with their parents or children in non-parental care, I found that there was this huge population of children, huge, that were not living with their parents, but also were not in foster care. So I've developed this very simple Venn diagram, which I use all the time in our community to raise awareness about how important kinship care is for children and actually the huge number of caregivers and children there are in our country and in our state and in Las Vegas. So foster care, these are children who have been formally removed and they are living with either traditional foster parents or with kinship foster parents. But the number of children in kinship care far exceeds that. So you've got this intersection of children who are in foster care with their relative. You have this side over here, children who are in foster care with a traditional foster parent like myself. You have this group of kids over here who are not in foster care, no child welfare involvement. They are in kinship care and they are with either a relative, close family friend, no child welfare involvement. So give you some perspective for Nevada, a little less than 5,000 children in foster care. About 40%, depending on the area, are in kinship foster care, right? So maybe 2,000 or so kids, but there's this 33,000 children in kinship care, so about 31,000 are without foster care involvement. That's a huge population. Do you think that these families over here are treated differently than these families here, are treated differently than these families here? Absolutely they are. So what I first had to do when I started trying to figure out what issues need to be changed for children in kinship care is identify the difference between informal kinship care or non-public and public or formal kinship care. This took a lot of time to understand and what policy drives each and what governs each area. Foster care has very specific requirements and very specific laws, but also very specific funding. And out here it was very gray. So in my research to solve problems, I took a lot of time to understand the landscape, and I highly recommend that you start by understanding the landscape of your problems so that you can better identify solutions. So what I did find, 5% of children in our country don't live with either of their biological parents. That's 1 out of every 20 kids. At least 1 or 2 in every classroom in our country are in non-parental care. And these children are far more likely to experience early childhood trauma than children who are living with their parents or with their parents. So if you've got 2 biological parents in your household, you see this blue bar is the 4 or more adverse family experiences, which could be any early childhood trauma that you're experiencing. And then with no biological parents in the household, right? This is our kids in non-parental care. They're far more likely to have experienced a lot more trauma. Now, what does that mean? Why do we care? Well, trauma and adverse childhood experiences in childhood predict just a range of negative outcomes over the lifespan, just a ton. So what do we see when we have kids who experience trauma? What happens when they grow up? We're going to see it repeat itself. This has been proven in research over and over. There's such a thing called generational trauma. Trauma repeats itself. I heard someone say in a podcast the other day, if you don't evolve, you're going to repeat. So unhealed childhood trauma can manifest as continued trauma for future generations. It's really important to say that the kids who are most at risk of this future sort of long-term negative health outcomes, these are the kids that don't have their parents. So when we talk about why does child welfare encourage kids staying with their parents? Well, there's some research that shows that they are less likely to be traumatized. Now, is there a causal effect here, right? Causal means one causes the other. I would argue that children who can't be with their parents have experienced trauma maybe because of their parents' situation, and that's why. Or people can say that the act of not being with your parents is trauma in itself, which has been also shown. That causes more trauma, which leads to these outcomes. We don't know for sure which comes first, but what I do know is that children who are not with either of their parents in non-parental care, whether it be kinship care or foster care, traditional foster care, they're more at risk. And so we have to intervene in their lives while they're kids. That is the time that I have chosen to spend a lot of my time working on. So the majority of children in non-parental care are living in kinship care, but there's a big difference between kinship care and foster care. So when I started doing the research on my issue, there was a lot of research, academic research, journals that have been published and peer-reviewed, which is sort of the standard for saying this is, something that we can scientifically say. They were looking at kids in foster care and comparing the children in foster care with the children in kinship care. Well, now you'll remember that there's actually not just one type of kinship care. And I knew this from, at this point, working at foster kinship, starting it, working with a variety of families. And I was like, there's like a ton of different types of kinship care with all these different accesses to support or not support. And I don't think you can just compare it. To me, it was comparing apples and oranges. So what I did was I started with a new framework. This is what I went to school to do because I just couldn't stop thinking about it. There had to be a better way to talk about kinship care so that we can start comparing apples to apples and not comparing apples to oranges and saying things are just blanket better or worse. So I was able to come up with these categories based on research and my own experience and what happens in real life, but there are actually 4 different types of children in kinship care, and they all have different experiences and different supports available to them, and we can't compare one to the other without knowing the differences. So my framework is there's licensed kinship foster care, there's unlicensed kinship foster care. This is the area where I got started. It's part 1 of my video. I'll tell the story of the differences here and why foster kinship got started in the first place. But then here's these families who are completely outside of the foster care system and kind of either doing it on their own, that's private kinship care. Grandma stepped up prior to any child welfare involvement and said, I need to help, or maybe your daughter left the child with you and then now you need to know what to do next, right? This is totally private. You're doing this on your own. You may have guardianship or some legal arrangement, but you're doing it privately. And then there's this other group of caregivers, which I will talk about in a different video because it's one of our policy priorities, but we call it voluntary kinship care or diverted kinship care. These are the families who are caring for children who are not in foster care, but who were basically told to do it by the child welfare agency. If you don't take this placement now, we're going to put this child in foster care. So you need to go get guardianship now or else. That's kind of what happens. Sometimes it's a great solution for the family and sometimes it's not. So it's something we're tracking closely. This is an area that people haven't studied much, and it's an area we just don't know if private foster care is better than kinship foster care, licensed or unlicensed. We don't know enough to know if any of these situations have better outcomes than children in traditional foster care. And in fact, the research just isn't been set up to look at kinship families the right way. So there's a lot of opportunity here. This is what I focus on academically. And so I'm sorry if I'm boring you at this point, but I just want to share the work that goes into coming up with a policy solution includes really understanding the types of families, the population you're working with, what is ruling how this family is created, and what support does this family have. This is my little diagram that I use to teach people about the different types of children in non-parental care so that they can better study it. So I came up with this framework because it didn't exist before. I found a gap in what people were doing, and I said, if we're going to solve problems, we need to have a better framework. So, you know, as you guys are going out and solving problems and looking at stuff, let me help you. It doesn't have to necessarily be through our CAN priorities, but I can still help you with the landscape. Are you trying to solve a problem that's just in the foster care system? I've got some ideas for you, and some research you can start with, and places to look for solutions, and states who are doing it well. Are you trying to solve a problem for kids who are not in foster care but in kinship care? Same thing, I can help you with that as well, but it's a totally different thing than the kids in foster care. Or are you going to be helping us solve the problem of diverted children? So kids who really are entitled to the support that maybe families would receive from foster care, but have been told to do it outside the system. And now you're like broke and have no legal support and you don't know what's going on. I can help you with that too. The important thing is to understand, where are you in this framework so that you can best affect change. Is it going to be a foster care change? Is it going to be something that has to change outside the system? What levers are you pushing? What laws are you looking at? Let's talk about it really practically so that we can help. This is just another way that I have identified kinship families in Nevada. And I teach this in my class because I want those who are doing policy change, who are going out with their great ideas, to understand that this is something that should be thought about very carefully. And again, I'm sharing this with you all because I want you to understand where you fit in terms of how Nevada looks at you, what's available to you, and so you know where you need to make the change. And again, let us help you. I will help you with, you know, the issues that you have. I can kind of point you in the right direction. Hey, that's a change that you have to talk to a foster care agency about, or that's a change that we need to go to welfare about, or that's a change we got to change state law, or it's got to be federal law change. You know, let's figure out where the change needs to happen. So what I found is, I was working at foster kinship now for a few years, and I found that children in unlicensed homes were disrupting. Okay, so unlicensed kinship homes, they were disrupting, which means they're saying, I can't do this. This child has to go back to child haven. I can't do this anymore. When we started looking, so DFS is coming to me and saying, your kinship families are disrupting. They're not good for kids. They're not stable. They're not able to do it. And I'm like, well, I know that these families are good for kids, and kids should be with their family, and it's way better for them to stay with family than to be with strangers. That's less trauma. So what's going on? Why are families disrupting? And when I looked into the data, right, so I'm looking into the very specific data, I found that it was our fictive kin families that were having a harder time. Why would fictive kin families have a harder time? So fictive kin are those of you that don't have a blood relationship, have a harder time maintaining placement in foster care. So we already know, because I already showed you, that there's two types of kinship foster care. There's unlicensed and there's licensed. Okay, so I've drawn this line here for you. This is where it gets complex. That's why I'm saying I'm Dr. Allie today. So our unlicensed homes were disrupting at a greater rate. And then there's this line here. What is this line? This is the number of families that are in not blood related, but family friend home. This is our fictive kin right here. And over here are like grandparents and aunts and uncles. So this is family friends, godparents, you know, great relationship to the child, but not blood related. What do we know about fictive kin versus blood relatives in foster care? First of all, we know that unlicensed families aren't getting paid. Second of all, I know, because I've been doing the work long enough, that the benefit available called child-only TANF, which is available to blood relatives, all of these guys, all you guys here under this line, is not available to fictive kin, because welfare doesn't see you as family, but DFS or foster care does. So that's a real problem. So what I was able to identify as my problem, sorry guys, children in unlicensed fictive kin foster homes were disrupting at a greater rate than other kinship foster care. So it's just this little section right here of people that I say, you know what, this is a problem. I can identify the problem. I understand why it's a problem, and I think I have a solution for it, but I need to figure out what that solution might be. So I've taken our problem definition, you see at the top here, where it's like 5% of kids are not with their parents, and this is why that's a big problem. But I've then taken it down to a place where I can maybe solve a piece of this. Because when you're looking to solve problems, you're looking to solve slices at a time. And so what we've done here is we've taken it down to a point where we can maybe get something done about this area. Now, am I helping all kids in kinship care? Not with this particular policy solution. I am identifying this small little triangle here. However, like I said before, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to get your foot in the door. You've got to start changing things, and stuff happens slowly, and it happens with very specific solutions. So what I did was I assembled the evidence for my policy problem. So I looked at who was already working on the issue, what the problem was, and actually, this is some progress that I made my class go through, but I wrote a policy paper on funding for kinship families in the state of Nevada, what's available and to who. And I looked at it and I found the gap that there's some funding that's not available to the specific group of people, and I didn't think that was equitable. So what we did was I reviewed what was needed. I looked at what was required. I looked at other states that were doing this better for fictive kin. So there was a couple states, like Washington State, for example, had opened it up so that fictive kin could access child-only TANF. I looked at think tanks and advocacy groups. I reached out to a group called Generations United, who has an attorney on staff that I really respect. And I said, what is preventing us from making this change? Is there anything that would be federally preventing Nevada from offering this benefit? She said, nope, it's not a federal requirement that you can't do it. It's just that your state is not doing it. So I worked really hard to identify a very specific issue, looked at what other states were doing, and then we went ahead and came up with some alternatives. Now, remember what I said in the beginning, alternatives just means what are the solutions? So the solutions to have children disrupt less in foster care would be, one, remove the licensing requirement. We could just say all kids in foster care are paid at the time of placement. You don't have to be licensed. I thought about, what if we require all kinship caregivers to complete licensing within 90 days of placement, but pay them at time of placement, right? So you still get paid at the time of placement, but you have to get licensed, right? That was a solution. Make child-only TANF available to fictive kin who have children in foster care. That was the one that I was going after the most, and I'll tell you why. And then we also had an idea, what if we have a new Social Security payment for children who are abandoned by their parents, so it comes out of a different funding stream? Or also, when you're identifying solutions, what happens if we do nothing? And what I did was I went through all of these alternatives and I looked at what's going to be feasible, what's doable, what would people accept in terms of change. Now, removing the licensing requirement and paying all children in foster care at time of placement, that's a real problem, because now we're seeing that families don't need training, they don't need to have their homes checked. We have safety concerns with this issue, and I felt like we'd run into a lot of opposition. So I kind of threw this one out because it's expensive, and some specific things I know, if a home isn't licensed, the state can't get federal dollars for that home. So that's not going to go, the state's not going to buy that. Not only is it not safe for kids, but the state's not going to get the money that they need to make foster care work, basically, and they're definitely going to oppose me if I put this forward. Now, number two is actually called provisional licensing, and some areas are doing this really successfully, and I still have this on my agenda for Clark County, right? I think provisional licensing makes a lot of sense. Families are paid right away, but they're also going through that training process so that they get safe. And they're also allowing the state to draw down federal funds so that we're not going broke. Number two is a great solution, but it's a long-term solution. It wasn't going to happen right away. So this is where I went with number three. If we could work with welfare, the welfare agency, to make TANF available to fictive kin who have children in foster care, we're solving a problem that is actually doable. And I felt like it was a small enough population that the state wouldn't fight us, welfare wouldn't fight us because they didn't really understand foster care. Foster care is not going to fight me because they're like, this is great. We want more families to get paid. We don't want them to disrupt. So I felt like I was able to find a path forward that would be, everyone would be happy with. People don't fully understand it enough to really oppose it. And we're solving a problem for a small group of people. So basically what we've gone through in this process, I'm using this as an example because we were able to be successful with this bill. We went from, I think there's a problem, to I got a lot of information, from defining the problem, and now I'm going forward. So I don't know, what I'll do is I'll stop here and then I will share the link so you can watch the actual bill be introduced in our Nevada legislative session last year, and you can see how they talk about it. And what I tell my classes, it's interesting because by the time you get to the bill stage, you're just, you've found someone who will sponsor you, and you've worked the language and you've gotten it in. And a lot of times they're just doing it. They don't necessarily know as much as you do behind the scenes, right? And so it's kind of funny to watch that because you'll be able to see that the information that they're presenting, they're less knowledgeable, but it got through, guys. And I'll also say we tried in 2017 and it didn't work. And Nevada only meets every 2 years, so we had to wait till 2019. And this is something I've been working on since, like I said, 2015. I don't even know, 2013. And it's such a small thing. It's such a small thing for our families, but this is how long it took, and this is how much work it was. But you've got to hold on to those small wins, and you can affect change. And if you've got things that you guys want to change that our Kinship Advocacy Network group isn't necessarily making a priority this next session, please reach out to me, Allie, and let me sort of help you think about how to do it, because I don't want you to ever feel stopped with your story. I want you to feel like your story and what your kids are going through deeply matter. And the more you understand about the issue, the more you can make these changes. Just like I strongly believe, the more you understand about what resources are available to you as kinship caregivers, the more you make the best decision for your family. This is the same thing. It's just on a much bigger scale. It's on that macro level. At your family, now we're looking at like all families and what's going to work. And so it's a different process, but it's the same way you advocate for your specific children in your home. You're just advocating at a different level to solve bigger problems. And so I'm here to support you. I want you to have what you need. I'm willing to do more training or get more specific. I know this was kind of complicated, and honestly, it's a doctoral level class that I teach over a couple of days. So it's very brief, but I need you guys to know that we're here for you. Foster Kinship cares deeply about what we're seeing. We only exist because of the problems that we heard from you. We only exist because of you, and we exist to serve you and for you. So please don't lose hope. Don't give up. Let us all work together on this. Guys, I got my PhD in this because I care that much. And I want to work on these issues, and I won't retire until we can kind of solve this kinship problem and solve the problems. And so let's work together on it, and let's keep moving. So I'm going to end here. I'm going to do some more training videos another day, just so that you can better understand where you fit in the landscape of kinship care in Nevada, and then how to tell your story to make change. But if you watch this, thank you. I'm just really wanting to encourage you. I don't want you to feel that it doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters. So you hold on to that fire, but you keep it, you keep that long game in mind, because these policy changes are a really long game, and you have to understand quite a bit about the world you're advocating in order to make change. I wanted to show you one thing that I have behind me before I end this, and you will see behind me I've got my degrees. If you see that little picture with the hearts, so that was given to me by the first child in kinship care that I ever worked with, not as foster kinship, but just as Allie, the mental health counselor who was working in the home. And I keep it behind me because that is what keeps me going. I have to remember that story every day, or I would get so discouraged and so depressed about all the stuff that we see and how upsetting it is and how much the system does need to change. But it can change with you and your involvement and knowing what you're doing. And please, let's work together on this and solve some problems. So I love you guys. Thanks for watching. Reach out. Okay. Talk to you later.